to extinguish the light of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but Allah has already decreed that He will complete His light, even if the disbelievers hate it. What you've heard today so far is the story of the war on terror. It's the experience of many of us, which is just the world we live in as Muslims, our experience of the world. It's a world that is defined by a war that is raging across the globe, across many spheres. I'm going to talk to you, inshallah, about how it's impacting the hearts and minds, not just the bodies, but the hearts and minds of Muslims. It's very difficult for non-Muslim people to actually connect with this, but when we talk, I'm sure it will resonate with you. First of all, let me ask, how many of you know personally anybody who's been tortured, say in Guantanamo Bay? One brother. Anyone know anyone who's died in the wars in Afghanistan or Iraq? Okay, one or two hands. How many of you know someone that's been on a control order? Okay, not many. How many of you know someone that's been stopped under Schedule 7? Okay, many more hands. How many of you know anyone who's been impacted by a policy called Prevent? Okay. You see, the war on terror began targeting a small section of the Muslim community, supposedly. But it never was really about that. In the end, I will share with you a few of the thoughts and plans of the architects of the war on terror, some of the thinkers and the policymakers who designed this global war. It was never actually intended to go for a small group of people. It was always intended to expand. Last year, approximately 20,000 Muslims, mostly Muslims, were stopped at the borders under Schedule 7 powers, all in the name of fighting terrorism. 99.99% of whom are innocent of any wrongdoing. Last year, approximately 7,000 kids were approached by Prevent. Again, largely Muslim, all in the name of fighting terrorism. How many of them are actually, kids? What terrorism have they done? The circle and the concern or the impact of the war on terror kept on growing wider and wider and wider. If it was really a war on terror, have you heard of a war being launched in Sri Lanka against the Tamil Tigers? I'm asking, have the Americans invaded Sri Lanka? Have they gone after the Basque separatists who are trying to establish a homeland for themselves in Europe and Spain? Have they gone after the FARC rebels in Colombia? They're all doing terrorism. It's a war on terror, but it seems to be only a war against Muslims. How many non-Muslims do you know that are held up in Guantanamo Bay? Go on, give me a guess. None. How many non-Muslims have been killed in drone strikes across Somalia, Yemen, Pakistan? You know, the game's up now. Everybody can see the truth. When we were younger, maybe 10, 15 years ago, it was a little bit murky. You know, people were saying, oh, it's not really a war against Islam. It's actually a war against, particular people who are violent and all of this. You see, violence, the game is up. People are fed up now. Everybody knows what's happening. The violence that the Western states mete out against the Muslim world on an industrial scale, that violence isn't called terrorism. Because according to them, that's legitimate violence, even though the Iraq war was an illegal war. Terrorism is a label that is used against what they believe is illegitimate violence. You understand? Anyone who takes up violence to defend themselves can be labeled a terrorist. We heard the story of Nelson Mandela earlier on. Terrorism is a label, it's just game. People are just fed up now. Everyone knows it's all a game now. Okay? This same language of war on terrorism is now being used against the Muslims in China, the Uyghur Muslims. Did bin Laden come from there? Huh? The war on terror was about bin Laden, remember? They went to go take out Al-Qaeda. I mean, there's no Bin Laden in China. There's no Bin Laden in Burma within the Rohingya people. How come they're all terrorists as well? What we have to understand is the war on terror was never really about what they call is Al-Qaeda or Taliban or whatever. Nowadays they're negotiating with Taliban and they're actually making peace. But originally we were told actually we're going to wipe out the Taliban and we're going to destroy them because we're going to end terrorism. Since the war on terror began, terrorism, what they call terrorism, has actually expanded all over the world. What this really is about is producing a narrative that links violence, what they call terrorism, political violence, to Islam and inextricably linking it, so you can't delink it. And then convincing the world that Islam causes violence. You see, this is the age we live in. The ones who actually murder and kill are talking about peace. And the ones who are actually peaceful are being cast as murderers and killers and all of these things. So what we're going to see is we have to understand how this is working. We have to understand where this is coming from. So I'm going to just pick on one or two examples to paint a picture. Before that, let's divide, not to say, I don't want anybody leaving here thinking the whole West and all the people in the West are evil and they're all against Islam. That is not true. All right? It's actually a very small group of people who had a plan and they were determined. And they actually played a trick on everybody. And they did a coup within key policy-making circles. After the 9/11 attacks, they carried out a policy coup. So we're going to talk about them. These are ideologically driven groups. They have an agenda. They're just using the fight against Islam to achieve their agenda. Secondly, there are nation states. Particularly, we're concerned about the Western nation states under the leadership of America and what their interests are. Thirdly is Western society, which is not the same as the state. Right? It's all the people who live in the West, in the societies of the West. And then fourthly are individual citizens. They're not all the same. Okay? They're not all friends, nor are they all enemies. So we have to be a little bit nuanced in understanding where this is coming from and who's responsible. This is an important group. You probably haven't even heard of their name. Who's heard of their name? Anyone heard of these guys? Maybe one brother who's old enough to know. Yeah, before 9/11 attacks, these guys put together a report, I think in the year 2000. And they argued, they had a grand plan for US domination across the world. Look at the kind of people who are affiliated to this group. They then went on to occupy some of the most powerful positions in America. And they're actually cross-party, by the way. It's not just, for example, right-wing or left-wing, they're cross-party. And these people, they're from a network or an ideological-based group called the neoconservatives. These are not all of them, but this is an example of some of the people here. And what they had is a vision. Their vision was to make the entire globe in the image of US values and US power. They wanted to establish a new world order. And what happened is the 9/11 attacks gave them the perfect excuse to carry this out. So the war on terror was created by neoconservatives, but it was then normalized by liberals. They just made it into just a part of life. Like, this is normal. You're meant to be suspicious against Muslims, and you're meant to actually have all these laws and all these policies that are meant to discipline, monitor, surveil, and control Muslims. Why? Because all terrorists are Muslims, which is a lie. And the more Muslim you are, the more likely you're going to be carrying out acts of violence, which is a lie. All of these are lies that were sold. Okay? Here's Wolfowitz, one of the key architects of this thinking. Back in 2003, he said, we need an Islamic reformation. Back in 2003, okay? That was the goal, to reform Islam. Here's another guy, Khalil Zad. He's a hardcore neoconservative. His wife put together a series of reports for one of the most powerful think tanks in America called RAND. And I'll be quoting for one of her reports, which is called Building Moderate Muslim Networks, which is basically a game plan for how to secularize Islam. The real game plan of the war on terror. In this report, and I could have cited from dozens, in recent years there's been a lot of study on this, and you can just do your own research and you'll find it all. But this is from 2007, if I'm not mistaken, from 2007. Back then, they were suggesting policies to the US government that in order for the war on terror to be successful, you can't just occupy and invade countries. What you need to do is control the hearts and minds of Muslims. You need to actually go there and change their belief system, change their worldview, mold them into something that is compliant, subservient to our way of life. Read it for yourself. It's there on the internet. Just Google it. You'll find it right now. And what their goal was to produce what they called moderate Muslims. Okay. Now this is a term that they created, but many others have coined similar terms. For example, the UK government uses the word. The Home Office uses the word reconciled Muslim. Okay. If I have time, we'll talk about it. But a secret unit called RICU actually is actively working to produce an Islamic identity which they called the reconciled Muslim identity. Reconciled between what? Reconciliation between what? Between what? I'm checking if you're awake. Reconciliation between what?
Islam and Western ideals.
Yeah, I mean basically, Iman and Kufr, or Islam and non-Islam, I mean whatever you want to call it. But there is no reconciliation really. At the essential level, there's no reconciliation. Islam has its way, and it's been there for like centuries. You can't reconcile it. This is the thing, we'll talk about it later, but this is the thing. Islam actually is extremely, not extremely, it's perfectly resilient against secularization. You simply can't secularize it. Even if you try, it's going to fail. It is the deen of Allah, and Allah will protect it. Maybe you can secularize Muslims, but you can't secularize Islam. But nevertheless, they've been trying for more than a decade. This is 2007. So the report actually outlines a set of views that what we want is at the end to produce Muslims that believe in a set of things. And they have markers. And there's five or six markers. You can see and read for them for yourself. But the first one is we want Muslims that believe in secular law and reject any other form of governance. Islamic governance, Islamic legal system, Islamic political system, Islamic state. What they're looking for is Muslims who agree to secular governing methods. If there is a Muslim that does not believe in this, then they mark him or her as extremist, because that's not an appropriate view to hold. Tell me, what does that have to do with bombing people and killing people? Nothing. It's your belief system, it's whatever you believe. Western democracy is an experiment at best. It's only been around a few decades. Human beings have been living according to various legal systems for centuries and millennia. But somehow they want to impose, and they believe that if you don't believe in the Western democratic system of government, then somehow you're inherently a threat. Right? And this is all lies. They just made it up. Secondly, liberal human rights. There is a particular conception of human rights from a liberal paradigm. They've said that an appropriate view of a Muslim is the one who agrees with our concept of human rights. If anyone brings another concept of human rights that, let's say, relies on an Islamic tradition or a Hindu tradition or any other tradition, this is not appropriate. And the list goes on. These are actually marked. And they've been designing policies from that time to actually shape the world view of Muslims. Muslim leaders, Muslim scholars, Muslim organizations, ultimately, obviously, Muslim governments. And from there, they argued that what the West needs is it needs partners. They can't achieve this war on terror and its goals just by bombing people to death. It's not possible. All right? And all of their wars have failed. Afghanistan is the biggest failure. It's the longest war that America has fought. And it's the biggest failure. They are forcibly humbled to sit at the table and negotiate with the very guys on the other side who they imprisoned in Guantanamo Bay. I mean, the actual guys. There's 5 guys who were in Guantanamo who were released. Those are the guys that are sitting on the table negotiating with the Americans. That's where the war on terror in Afghanistan has led them. And I don't need to talk about Iraq. I mean, all across it's a failure. At what cost? Thousands and hundreds of thousands of innocent lives. And that same war is still working, however, on this front. So the 3 partners they need is secular Muslims. And the Muslim world is full of them, especially amongst the elites and those who rule the Muslim countries. But also they're in the West as well. They need those partners. They can't do it on their own. Right? Imagine someone who looks like and talks like Tony Blair coming and lecturing you on Islam. You're not going to listen. But if, for example, someone comes and their name is Sarah Khan, and they start talking about Muslim women and stuff, you're going to think, okay, she's a Muslim. Let's give her a bit of time, listen what she's got to say. So they need partners. They need liberal Muslims. And then they also need, thirdly, some traditional Muslims who are quietists. They're pacifists. They just want to keep their Islam to study, learning, and personal matters. They need them as partners. And they have actually been actively searching and working with these people. Okay. So Tony Blair, a well-known architect of the war on terror, he is still very active, very, very active in actually pushing this narrative that Islam is inherently violent, that Muslims are all meant to be suspect, and until you change Islam, you're not going to have world peace and all of this nonsense that he goes on about. David Cameron, 2015, adopted this narrative and made it policy. He said that we're now going to actively encourage the reforming and moderate Muslim voices. And this actually was his policy. When he was in government, he actually passed a series of laws that were in line with this policy. Okay? In the UK, there are several groups. Okay, another day we'll talk about all of them, but these are some examples of very committed, ideologically committed groups. They're not actually big in number, but they're well resourced and they're very influential. Okay, and there are many, many more. Some of them are directly agents of the government, like the Commission for Countering Extremism, and then some of them are not directly officially linked to government, but they're highly influential because their thinking and the people it's like a revolving door. Sometimes they're in the think tank, sometimes they're in government, and vice versa, okay? And then you have the native informants like William and others. What are the real goals behind this? Ultimately, is to try to force Islam through a process of reformation. Okay, you have to go back in history to understand why they think this is possible, because the Enlightenment period of Europe, which was after the reformation of the church, all of that happened, and Western thinkers believed that just like Christianity could be secularized and then brought into line and compliant with the new world where God doesn't exist, where society, government and everything is actually designed by man, you can do the same thing. And they're obviously wrong, because actually that's just a theory, and the Creator sent down the revelation for all walks of life. As Muslims, we believe in that with 100% conviction. An unbeliever probably won't understand that, but as Muslims, we know this to be true, and it's been true for centuries. So, in order to now control Islam and Muslims, you have to fracture the relationship between the Muslims and their deen. And that happens by fracturing their identity. When Muslims become confused about who they are, and they start getting muddled up about what is the essence of their identity, who they are, then all of this problem starts. And that's why that is the ultimate aim. One of the biggest tasks of the Muslim Ummah today is to actually work hard in preserving the identity of Muslims. The reconciled Muslim identity agenda on one hand, and the reforming Islam agenda similar, against the preserving of the Muslim identity. The war on terror is ultimately will never succeed until it achieves that aim of changing the Muslim identity by mixing into Islam something that does not belong to it. So I want to finish off by just, if you can just pass my laptop. I just finish off by just referring to a few verses, inshallah, from the Quran, which give us clarity. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Surah Hajj, وَجَاهِدُوا فِي اللَّهِ حَقَّ جِهَادِهِ هُوَ اجْتَبَاكُمْ وَمَا جَعَلَ عَلَيْكُمْ فِي الدِّينِ مِنْ حَرَجٍ مِلَّةَ أَبِيكُمْ إِبْرَاهِيمَ هُوَ سَمَّاكُمُ الْمُسْلِمِينَ هُوَ سَمَّاكُمُ الْمُسْلِمِينَ. He is the one who named you Muslims, Allah. مِنْ قَبْلُ وَفِي هَذَا لِيَكُونَ الرَّسُولُ شَهِيدًا عَلَيْكُمْ وَتَكُونُ شُهَدَاءَ عَلَى النَّاسِ. In this verse, Allah explains the task of the Muslim Ummah. He asks the Ummah, commands them, perform jihad in Allah's way, struggle in His way, in a way that is befitting the worship of the Lord. He has chosen for you, He has chosen you for this deen. Allah has chosen you for this deen. What is this deen? Millata abikum Ibrahim. It's the way of your father, Ibrahim alayhi salam. It's not something new. It's the way of all the prophets. And then Allah says, Allah named you Muslims. That is your identity. He named you. If He named you Muslim, it is His right to tell you what Islam is. You can't come along and say, I self-define as a Muslim. It's not possible. When you become Muslim, you enter into a contract with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The terms of the contract dictate that when you become Muslim according to what Allah determines to be Islam. You can't come and say, I'm a Muslim and now I determine how I'm going to worship Allah. No. If you want to do that, then you don't enter the contract. That's fair enough. You don't have to be part of the contract. You can always come out of it. La ikraha fid deen. There's no compulsion in religion. You choose. But once you've chosen Islam, you abide by whatever Allah has dictated. He chose us and He named us Muslims, and then He told us what Islam means. It means to surrender yourself completely, wholeheartedly to Allah's will, to live your life according to His guidance, to believe that all source of moral authority belong to Allah. He's the only one who determines what is right and what is wrong. To abide by His commandments. That's what being a Muslim is. Now, as much as the architects and the policymakers of the war on terror try, they won't be able to change that. But however, some weak Muslims will fall for it. That's true. Some weak Muslims will fall for it, as many have. In another verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, وَإِن كَادُوا لَيَفْتِنُونَكَ عَنِ الَّذِي أَوْحَيْنَا إِلَيْكَ لِتَفْتَرِيَ عَلَيْنَا غَيْرَهُ وَإِذًا لَاتَّخَذُوكَ خَلِيلًا. And indeed, they were about to tempt you away from that which we revealed to you in order to make you invent about us something else. Allah is talking to Muhammad directly, and He's saying, verily they, your enemies, tried to tempt you away from the deen, from what I revealed. And they were about to make you fabricate something. Fabricate something meaning add to the religion something that doesn't belong to it. Or take away from it something that doesn't belong to it. And if you did that, then Allah says, they would have taken you as a friend. They would have made peace, brought you into their, friendship and loyalty. وَلَوْلَا أَن ثَبَّتْنَاكَ لَقَدْ كِدْتَ تَرْكَنُ إِلَيْهِمْ شَيْئًا قَلِيلًا. And if I, Allah, did not strengthen you, then you would have almost inclined to them a little bit. If Allah didn't strengthen the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, he himself would have fallen for those temptations. إِذَا لَأَذَقْنَاقَ ضُعْفَ الْحَيَاةِ وَضُعْفَ الْمَمَاتِ ثُمَّ لَا تَجِدُ لَكَ عَلَيْنَا نَصِيرًا. And if you did that, if you did fall into it even a little bit, Allah says to him, Muhammad ﷺ, if you had, we would have made you taste double punishment in life and double punishment after death. Then you would not find for yourself against us a helper. If Allah was threatening His most beloved with changing the religion, the dangers of changing the deen. If Allah was threatening His most beloved sallallahu alaihi wasallam in such a serious way, when we have to understand what is at stake. Okay? If you can't go and change the world, it doesn't matter. If you can't go and establish the deen, it doesn't matter. If you can't go and give dawah to hundreds and thousands, it doesn't matter. But the minimum you must do is preserve the deen. Hold on to it. Don't change it. Okay? And then if Allah gives you tawfiq, Allah may choose you for doing more and more work. To conclude, I have some other things, but maybe inshallah in the Q&A. To conclude, just to summarize and say that the war on terror, though it began in 2001, and though it was purportedly targeting Al-Qaeda and Taliban and associated groups and things, it's actually become very, very clear that the agenda was never that. Those who were actually tuned in, switched on at the time, realized this and didn't fall for the trap. Some Muslims, however, fell for the trap. They fell for the divide and rule game, and they made very grave errors. Now we have no excuse. Everything is clear as day. Look around you. The alliance that is being formed, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Trump. I mean, is there anything hidden anymore? In the UK, the Prevent program is being exposed again and again and again. Just single-handedly by one little small organization called Cage. Single-handedly with Allah's tawfiq have exposed again and again Prevent and its real agenda. So my appeal is, brothers and sisters, be proud of your deen, be confident in your deen, have tawakkul upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, feel honored that you're actually part of the ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Don't be afraid. Okay, fear will paralyze you. The rule is, whatever you're afraid of will come to control you. So don't be afraid of anything except Allah. You should only be in the control and subjugation of the Almighty. You should be in the subjugation of nobody else. So don't be afraid. We've got a lot of people, we've got a lot of resources, we've got a lot of rich history. Every time the Ummah faced difficulties, it was resilient and it came back. Allah will preserve His deen. Allah will make sure that His light is never extinguished. You should just have yaqeen in that. And then dedicate yourself. Find a cause in life. Find a cause, find a purpose. It has to be a little bit more than just earning a bit of money and living and surviving. Surely, our aims and intentions are much higher. Our aspirations to be higher. So may Allah give tawfiq, and if you can, you should help Cage and others who are trying to work for justice, for truth, for deen. You should try to extend your support, inshallah. May Allah give tawfiq. Jazakumullah khair.